Muy buenas noches a todos, bienvenidos a su casa, Books and Books. En nombre del señor Mitchell Kaplan y de todo el equipo, les damos la más cordial bienvenida y agradecemos que en un día tan un poco complicado como es el viernes, empezando diciembre, nos hagan el favor de acompañarnos, pero nos sentimos muy agradecidos doblemente porque en especial le tenemos un aprecio al doctor Pedreira, que ha estado con nosotros en otras ocasiones y sabemos de su labor educativa y de todo el esfuerzo que hace también apoyando a todo lo relacionado con la investigación de Cuba. Tenemos hoy el privilegio de que nos acompañe el señor Sebastián Arcos, director interino del Instituto de Investigación de Cuba en FIU, quien va a presentar al doctor. Y también les queremos recordar que todos los eventos que hacemos durante un año son más de 400. En promedio son 2 eventos por día, en donde apoyamos a los autores, a las personas que están apoyando a la comunidad. Y últimamente el fundador y dueño de la tienda abrió este es su primer año, la Fundación Literaria, que apoya a todo lo que es a llevar libros a colegios de niños que no tienen recursos, en donde también acompañan los autores, y no solamente es educar a los niños acerca de la creatividad de la escritura y de la importancia de la lectura, sino también se les donan los libros. Antes se acostumbraba a que si algún autor llegaba a participar en un evento escolar, se solicitaba que los niños tuvieran que pagar el libro, y ahora no. Entonces ha tenido maravillosos resultados. Este fue nuestro primer año, logramos completar la cuota, entonces nada más tenerlo presente si de alguna manera nos pueden seguir apoyando. Nuevamente están en su casa. Vamos a disfrutar de este buen libro, de esta buena plática, y al final vamos a tener a la venta el libro del doctor y él va amablemente a firmarlo. Muchas gracias y buenas noches.
Muy buenas noches. Muchísimas gracias por venir, por estar con nosotros. Hoy es una noche de lujo porque tenemos a Daniel, que es no solo un gran amigo del Instituto, sino también un distinguido profesor de FIU. Les prometo que voy a ser muy breve. Lo que pasa es que la biografía de Daniel es bastante larga. Una página. Pero apretadita, ¿eh? Me da una envidia tremenda cada vez que veo la biografía de Daniel. Es increíble, es increíble. Daniel es profesor asistente del Departamento de Política y Relaciones Internacionales de la Escuela de Asuntos Públicos e Internacionales de FIU. La escuela se llama SIPA en inglés, School of International and Public Affairs. Daniel tiene un doctorado y un máster en Ciencias Políticas y además un certificado de Estudios de América Latina y del Caribe de FIU. Tiene además una maestría en Operaciones de Paz de la Universidad George Mason y una licenciatura en Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad de Miami. Daniel fue asistente de la congresista Eliana Ros-Lehtinen del año 2007 al año 2013, cuando ella presidía el Comité de Relaciones Exteriores de la Cámara de Representantes. Y trabajó además con el Centro para Cuba Libre de Washington, y ese es otro de los overlaps que tenemos con Daniel. Actualmente preside el Pen Club de Escritores Cubanos Exiliados y es miembro de la Junta Directiva del Instituto de la Memoria Histórica, acá, Cubana, la Memoria Histórica Cubana contra el Totalitarismo. Además del libro que presentamos esta noche, el doctor Pedreira es autor de 4 libros. Un instrumento de paz, la vida del embajador Guillermo Belt Ramírez, del año 19. El Pen Club de escritores cubanos en el exilio, también del año 19. El último constituyente, el desarrollo político de Emilio Millo Ochoa, del año 13. Lo que les decía que me daba envidia cuando leía la biografía. Tiene 4 libros publicados, contando este que vamos a presentar esta noche. Daniel va a hacer su presentación y después va a contestar preguntas. Por favor, levanten la mano, identifíquense antes de hacer su pregunta. Daniel, bienvenido.
Bueno, muchas gracias ante todo a todos por estar aquí esta noche. Sé que el tráfico estuvo complicado, así que gracias por la paciencia y por la persistencia en llegar aquí. The event was announced in English, the book's in Spanish, so I think let's split it 50-50 and play it by ear. So I'll present most of what I want to say in English, but then I'll answer questions or maybe make some remarks in Spanish as well about the book, just to kind of reach out to everyone. So first, I want to give thanks to the Cuban Research Institute at FIU, to Sebastián for proposing that this presentation take place, for Aimee, for all her work, Aimee Correa. Also to Books and Books, Mitchell Kaplan, Cristina Nosti, Mark Meneses, who helped internally organize every detail, and the rest of the team here. Also for thanks to my colleagues at FIU, Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs, and especially the Department of Politics and International Relations, for being here to support me, and I really appreciate it. And also to the Institute for Cuba's Historical Memory Against Totalitarianism, which is the organization that proposed that I write this book, gave me the idea to write this book, and is a nonprofit organization that basically works to preserve Cuba's historical memory through interviews, books, documentaries. Thanks again to all of you. And I especially want to thank, and I just saw him come in, Ambassador Martin Palausch. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your constant support. I really appreciate your presence. So this book is kind of the beginning of a conversation that I think needs to be had on the topic of disappearances in Cuba. We often, when we talk about Cuba and different human rights elements during the past 67 years, almost 67 years, we focus on the political prisoners, we focus on the executions, we focus on a wide variety of human rights abuses, but we don't really stop to think of these cases where disappearances have occurred. And it's not really a leap to consider that there would be people who disappeared in Cuba during all these years, considering that we are aware of similar cases in other authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. So we're familiar with disappearances in Argentina, Chile during those dictatorships, Spain as well, China, the Soviet Union, other countries. So why would Cuba be different, right? And so I took the approach of trying to reconceptualize disappearances. We often think about forced disappearances. So the disappearances of people that, kind of your textbook case of the police or secret police showing up to someone's home or workplace, picking them up, taking them and then never being heard from again, right? And of course, there are cases of those, but the idea of disappearances in this book is a little bit more expansive. So here, I also include combat deaths, particularly of people missing in action, basically. So people, for example, that fought in the Escambray Mountains in the early 60s, who there are reports that they were killed, and for all intents and purposes they were, but then they might have been buried in common or mass graves, never heard from again. So there isn't that final detail of, if they are dead, where is their documentation of their death, the details, the circumstances of their death, and where are they buried. Also, I extended to refugees lost at sea during different eras, particularly in the 1990s. Also, Cubans missing in action abroad. Angola is kind of the main case where Cubans went to fight and died in battle. There was, for a long time, this idea that those that had fallen in Angola had been, their bodies had been sent back to Cuba, but that's not the case. The book indicates that there were some that were just never accounted for. And we're seeing it today in Ukraine with the Cubans that are falling in battle in Ukraine, being buried in mass graves, or family members not given any information. So this is something that is not just historical, but is actually happening today as well. So within those categories, I was able to identify 614 cases. Now that's a very conservative number. Obviously, when you account for the numbers of executions and people that may have been lost at sea, etc., those numbers would be higher. But I stuck to that number because those were the cases that I was able to identify with a name, a date either of birth or disappearance, and a place. I came across a lot of accounts, for example, testimonials that would allude to a group of people being lost at sea, or a group of people being executed and buried in mass graves, but their names were not there. So it's very hard to really include them if I don't have the direct information. So really what all of these categories share in common is that the culprit, whether directly or indirectly, is the Cuban dictatorship. So directly, if it's a forced disappearance; indirectly, if it's people that are refugees lost at sea, they still, were prompted to carry out the decision to leave the country in that precarious way because of the situation established by the dictatorship. This book also tries to incorporate the cases of disappearances in Cuba within the broader scope of disappearances worldwide. So a lot of times we talk about Cuba, we think about Cuba as an isolated case, and we don't stop to think that, this has happened somewhere else to a greater or lesser degree. So we maybe should start talking about Cuba in more of an international sense rather than just isolating it to Cuba, because I think that way the idea or the vision of what's happening in Cuba is better understood, right? If you compare it to situations that have happened in the past. So obviously there's limitations to the study. Like I said, 614 is a very conservative number, although I think it's an important start. But in most cases where these issues have been raised, have been investigated, have been documented, it occurs during a period of transition to democracy. It occurs after the fall of a dictatorship. So that's where the archives open up. That's where individuals feel more free to relate what happened to their relatives, to find or to look for answers. Right now, the dictatorship's still there, so that's impossible to do. You can't go to Cuba and start asking these questions. So everything that you can do has to be done from abroad, which limits what we can do, but it definitely is an important start, I think. You also, again, because of the situation, you have fear from family members in Cuba. You have family members who want to know the truth and who have maybe tried to ask some questions and have been threatened with harm. In some cases that I mentioned in the book, one of the common themes that arose in the book from different testimonials in different periods is that there have been individuals who have tried to ask the hard questions about their relatives and what happened with their disappearances, and they've basically been threatened by Cuban authorities, basically to the effect of being told, oh, if you keep asking about your relative, the same thing might happen to you. So there's, on the one hand, this official government line that there's no disappearances in Cuba, there have never been disappearances in Cuba, but at the same time, it's used as a tool to prevent investigations or questions being asked on these disappearances. And that is also a practice that continues today, although it's a practice that, again, is not very much denounced. It's not talked about in the way that other repressive tactics are talked about. And really also something else I tried to do with this book is make it in some small or modest way a document for future investigations on disappearances in Cuba. So again, just the tip of the iceberg, the beginning of investigations that eventually, like we've seen in other cases where similar issues have arisen, that can lead with more information, more research, more details to indictments, prosecutions of those guilty in a transitional justice setting. Again, this is once there's a transition to democracy. This won't be, under the current dictatorship, but the hope is that there is a document there that'll get the ball rolling, that'll help other researchers not have to start from scratch. They have a basis, they have some names that they can start looking into. Obviously those names, especially in cases where there were several people involved, several people disappeared at once, then more names can come up and that information can be rounded out. So basically that's a summary of the book. It starts kind of with the conceptual, broader comparative introduction, and then I include the cases that I mentioned, the 614, all those details, they're sorted by category, and then within those categories chronologically from 59 until just a few months ago, practically. And then kind of the more forward-looking portion of the book is, looking at all these international organizations that exist that have tackled and discussed and work on issues of disappearances, and how these cases can also be brought to those bodies. So that's basically what the book is about. I welcome your questions, comments, and thank you again all for being here.
Danny, very impressive. I think you started some research that can bloom. My question is the following. Of these 614 cases, which category do they fall in? You mentioned the people that were lost on the Florida streets, the people who were lost in Africa, right? Do you have some preliminary figures? And then second, I lived in the North Gables for the last 30 years, And Graceland Cemetery has a monument to the Cubans who died crossing the Florida streets. And so I think that's could you talk about those things?
Yeah, so as far as preliminary figures from those numbers, the majority would be lost in the Florida Straits. The rest, I think most would be kind of as a number two would be the combat deaths in Cuba. Then the forced disappearances, and then kind of last would be the combat deaths abroad. But again, these are just based on what this sample presents. It could change.
And how big of an underestimation are the people lost? I mean, what do you think is the reasonable number of the people who were lost in the streets?
Lost at sea, you mean?
Yeah.
It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell because sometimes and we've living in this community, we're familiar, and we have been for years and decades of these stories of people coming in day after day in some cases, right, in certain periods. So sometimes you might know the name of the person that died on kind of on the best case scenario, right? At least you have a name and ideally a face to go with that name. But sometimes you remember the 90s when the rafts were coming in with bodies and no one had survived, and there was no real information there. So unless a relative eventually were to come forward and say, my relative left on this date and we haven't heard from them and it's been 5 months, you presume that they're dead, but really they're disappeared. You don't know what ended up happening, right? You kind of assume, but you don't have the proof to kind of provide that closure. Yep.
Is it the same type of pushback even for those that were in the military in Angola or some other, in the lines of service, where the Cuban government is still giving pushback when you're making a general inquiry?
Yeah, there is pushback. So in the case of Angola, there was an official line by the government that everyone who fell in Angola in combat was sent back. Their bodies were sent back to Cuba, and so there were no one was disappeared. But there are documented cases of individuals who disappeared, and the Cuban government just never accounted for what happened to their bodies, right? In the case of Ukraine, which again is the one that we're seeing today, what's happening is they're being sent to fight under false pretenses. They're being told that they're going to get all these benefits and they're going to get money, and once they get there, it's really to fight on the Russian side against Ukraine. And when they are killed, and a significant number has already been killed of Cubans in Ukraine, they're basically buried in mass graves. Family members ask questions to not just the Cuban government, but also the Russian government. They don't get responses. Sometimes they're told, oh yeah, they died, but we can't bring the body back, or they get the runaround. They don't really get a concrete response as to, yeah, exactly. A lot of bait and switch throughout the entire process. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for your project. I'm Central European, so I'm coming from slightly different perspective, but I think all these disappearances are almost the natural character of totalitarian regimes.
Right.
We have the case of Camilo Cienfuegos, who was a great hero of the revolution, and he was doomed to disappear because the leaders of that totalitarian conspiracy made their choice.
Right.
So there are so many people who disappeared because of the totalitarianism of the regime. how young generation can be reminded that this type of annihilation, that the story of concrete human beings needs to be eradicated. I think it's much bigger problem. With all due respect to the 600 plus individuals, great job, thank you for that. But I think that this annihilation is much larger project because it's the nature of the regime.
Right, I agree. It's and that's kind of another one of the motivations to write the book is that, a lot of times when we, and again, it happens, I think, because we're in Miami, because we're almost saturated with news on Cuba. So it's hard to study Cuba or discuss Cuba within the broader context, right? And in this case, within the broader context of authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. So one of my goals was with this book is to say, look, this is happening in Cuba, but by the way, this also happened in X, Y, Z, all these countries that I mentioned at the beginning, we, I think, going forward should study, what those countries did to find out what happened, what methods they carried out later on to not only document, but then going forward after that, once you have the documentation, then what do you do legally? What do you do procedurally? So yeah, I totally agree with you that this should be included within and thought of within the context of similar regimes. Yep.
So speaking of that, my question is specifically about the cases you cite. There's been a lot written about this topic for Latin American dictatorships of the right, Chile, Argentina, Guatemala. Are those included in the ones you cite in the book? That's my question.
Oh, yeah, I included, so let me try to think. I included Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, Vietnam with the boat people. And there is literature where the boat people in Vietnam are considered disappeared. So, right, so like that's another example, right? If they're disappeared, why are the people that left on rafts from Cuba not, right? Also, Franco's Spain. I allude to like one of the most famous cases of disappearances in the world, Federico Garcia Lorca, and I think there's a few others that I mentioned there to again tie in the idea that this has happened and continues to happen in other cases. Yep.
Hey, Professor. Just kind of curious as to right now the underreported side of Cubans being in the Ukrainian-Russian war. I'm just kind of curious, maybe it's a little bit outside the scope of the research of the book because it's focusing on past disappearances, but just kind of curious if that trend, given it's an ongoing war, seems to be expanding, decreasing, evolving.
You mean in terms of the numbers of disappearances in Ukraine?
Involuntary find themselves in the war.
I mean, given the last numbers that I've seen of combat deaths in Ukraine of Cubans, it's increased. So again, this book is not going to take those into account because of this has happened in the last few months, but yes, the numbers have increased. The situation as far as changing the way that they were dealing with the combat deaths, bringing back the bodies to Cuba, or even accounting for those deaths has not been remedied, has not changed. So that stays constant. But the numbers have increased.
How many numbers are we talking about?
The last I saw was a few hundred, at least. There's this. It depends what source you're looking at, but it was a few hundred fallen. Yes.
I think it's important for the public, particularly those who are not Cuban Americans or familiar with. If you can please make a clear difference between those who disappeared and those who are victims of the dictatorship. Because in the case of Chile, 3,000 people were killed. They are victims, and a few of those disappeared. In the case of Argentina, almost
Right.
10,000 were killed, and a lot of those disappeared.
Right.
So the 600 that you have in the book doesn't mean that the Cuban regime is responsible for just 600 victims.
Oh no, of course, yes. We're talking about disappearances. So we're not talking about executions, right? Where there is a clear, for example, when there's an execution, usually, and again, if we're talking about straight regular executions, there's a trial, even if it's a sham trial. There's a sentence. There's a sentence that's signed, there's a date, there's a place, there's a name of someone that is executed. In the case of even if someone died in prison, maybe on a hunger strike or due to medical negligence, right? That's not what we're talking about here. These are people that we don't know what happened to them, right? These are people that, yes, they must have died. Some for example, if they fell in combat, we presume that they maybe were shot in a fire exchange, but they could have been executed. They could, we don't know the details. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know where their bodies are, right? So that's really the key to this 614. That again is, I'm sure, larger. But right, we're not talking about the other deaths that have occurred that are better documented by different means, which that number is presumably greater than the 614. Yes, oh, of course, yeah.
Hey, Dr. Pedreira, well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on this awesome book.
Thank you.
I just want to ask you about, on top of these whole material disappearances, there is also some voice disappearance, right? That might be like hiding some of the reality that all these disappearances, experience. So, what will be your guess toward these voices? Like, what will be their expressions, like if they were still alive, and what do you think will be the implication of both disappearances, like live disappearances and voice disappearances, for the historical truth of Cuba? And
That's a great question, and you reminded me of another point that I wanted to make with the book, and I think I made it in the book, and it's that at any point, if you look, and that's why I really, aside from the documentary part of it, I wanted to include, as best I could, dates of birth and dates of disappearances, because what you see at the end is the vast majority of those disappeared are young people, right? At any point, right? In the 60s, they were young people. In the, when they disappeared, they were young people, meaning that that's the country's future, right? So some might have been involved in politics against the government. Some probably weren't. They were just dissatisfied with the situation. So they, but in either case, you're shutting down not just the potential that those individuals had to create a better country, but you're shutting down their voice and their agency and everything that goes with it. So that's a great question.
Yeah, congratulations,
Thank you.
Dr. Pedreira. This is a great book, and I think it's a great contribution. Many human rights organizations wrote reports during dictatorships and have done the work that you have done, and it has been a very valuable one. So congratulations for your contribution.
Thank you.
And for the sake of trying to understand who these people are, could you please give us some demographic details about ages, gender, if they come from the countryside, from the urban areas? Do you have that information?
Yeah, and actually, thank you for being one of the first people to give me information on a similar case in Uruguay and a similar report. So I did include Uruguay in those cases as well. So I didn't do a scientific look at the demographics in terms of really counting the locations again, because we didn't exactly have, sometimes we had where they were last seen, but that may not be necessarily where they were from. So it's hard to gauge that with the information that I had. As far as age, definitely they were between, I would say, their 20s and their 40s mostly. In terms of men and women, I think it's mostly men. Women, you started seeing more in the refugees leaving the country by sea. That's where you really see more women, but mostly, especially obviously the combat deaths, mostly men. The forced disappearances also mostly, if not all, men. So there is that difference. So yeah, there are elements that you can look at, but it was hard to do with incomplete information, and I didn't want to provide figures that maybe were not too accurate to be useful. But I think you can glean a lot from it from the book. Sure.
I know it's an ancient book, but in the book by Hugh Thomas about Cuba, he goes into a not very deep analysis, nothing like what you've done, so we all have to congratulate you for your effort.
You.
But one of the things that he says basically that he could never figure out were the number of people who died in the revolution against Batista. In either side, it was complicated by some newspaper people exaggerating and the famous 10,000 deaths and all that stuff. Do you think that there would be any hope in trying to clear that issue, or do you think that's just happened too long ago?
You mean in the deaths prior to Batista? Prior to Castro, under Batista?
In the so-called revolution in the cities and then in the field.
I think that there have been attempts to do that. I'm not sure if a definitive number can be reached. I think Maria Wenceslao, with her Cuba archive, has done some of that. The number that I think it was Bohemia gave in the 50s, late 50s was 20,000. The number, I think her number was 1,000 something. That, and again, we give these numbers based on, because the methodology is similar, based on cases that you can verify with, not just hearsay, but actually have details that you can verify. So she, and a lot of the information I got for the book was from her project. But she has done research on that, and she has, I know it's over 1,000, but under 2,000. I can verify that number could be higher, but definitely not the 20,000, right? So there has been work.
You don't think it would be very easy to go that far back now, right?
Well, I mean,
maybe because there were still records being kept in the cities and such.
So so part of it is the records and what the records say and where those archives are. That's part of it. A lot of what the Cuba archive takes its information from is family testimonials. So a relative whose family member was killed, they have this questionnaire and they fill it out with like a name, date of birth, whatever, all the basic information, and then like a narrative of what happened, right? So that's really where a lot of that information comes from. So it's a mix of both the official records and testimonials from family, friends, neighbors who knew of specific cases that can come forward.
Daniel, if I may make a comment regarding what the issue of the 20,000 deaths. It might be easier to find out the actual number, because we have to remember that Cuba used to have a free press when Batista was a dictator. And that's not the case. So it might be easier to go back into those archives of that free press and find out the names of people that were killed back.
That's a good point, yes.
Right. Yes.
Still, I think there's a deeper problem here of disappeared people. What I think about is the Holocaust. People who simply disappeared without leaving any trace, any name, recognition. So one author said that you need to put your ear on the ground to hear all these voices that cannot speak for themselves, who are even not registered, who cannot be turned into stories because they simply disappeared. And this is what the totalitarian regimes is all about.
Right.
So I think that maybe Cuban regime is not that bad as Nazi regime who organized the Holocaust was, but still these disappearances are a deeper problem than, and thank you again for the 600+ individuals, but there are so many others who simply disappeared without trace, and no one hear or listens to their voices.
Right, and and that's, I think, a question to consider in the future of a transition. We're always talking about plans for a transition, and everyone's talking about the future. But I think we need to not just with the disappeared, but with other issues of transitional justice, transitional or historical memory, where we have to ask these questions and find a way to answer, right? To see how these issues are tackled in the future. Right now, we're limited in what we can do. Definitely, we can't rely on people coming forward in Cuba, but it is something to think about. And kind of the idea here with a lot of this is to start that consciousness and to at least include it in the conversation, that these are topics that need to be discussed and thought about.
You know, a friend of mine that I went to graduate school with worked on Cambodia, and he was very much involved in the disappearance and the crimes that occurred in Cambodia, which looked in the 1970s when I knew him. You know, I told him it was a pipe dream, that how would you ever figure this out, given the numbers? And the truth is that they did. Right? It was painful, it was horrible. And it's what he says, once you get on the ground, once the archives are open, once we set up a system of investigation and justice, is not an impossible task.
Right.
It's just impossible now.
Yeah. John?
Yes. Daniel, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It got me thinking, given what's happening now in Cuba with the mosquito-borne illness, public health crisis, and the inability of the government to meet it, that there have to be an exponential number of deaths that are taking place, and have done probably over the course of the past year. So I would have to think that probably there will be cases of disappearances as well, because the government isn't going to want to be upfront with the people about exactly how many people are dying. So do you know anything about that? Have you heard anything about any kinds of reporting coming out of Cuba about whether, you know, people are having family members, loved ones go for treatment and then never seeing them again?
Not specifically of family members going in for treatment and not being seen again. There is a high number of deaths currently. There's several viruses and illnesses that are going around in Cuba. The number of deaths has gotten so high that the health system, if you will, or the process of burying the dead has kind of overwhelmed cemeteries and the health system to the point that they've resorted to mass graves. They did that during COVID as well. They denied it at first, but then there was photographic evidence, so they couldn't deny it anymore. So they've done it again in the past few months. So I could see it lending itself to that scenario, especially if this crisis continues to grow. But right now, I haven't heard of any cases where someone goes in for, you know, treatment and then is never heard from again, right? basically the family members would be told they died, and then the family members left to scramble to find a coffin, to find, because even funeral homes are overwhelmed, so they have to figure out, and then there's no supplies, there's no coffins, right? So they have to resort to people that will sell them to them through the black market. So it's a whole mess.
I would have to think there would be a way to connect the dots between tracing it back from mass graves to people not being told what ended up happening with their loved ones.
Right, and again, that's one of
That's a disappearance.
the difficult things now that you can't do it now in Cuba, right? Unless someone gets a testimonial out anonymously, in some way, which now with technology, thankfully, we're able to get more information out than before. But still, again, in the current circumstances, that's very hard to do. I think once there is a democratic change in Cuba or a transition, I think there's going to be a barrage of not just denunciations of disappearances, but in general of other crimes that were kept silent for a long time, because that fear will be lifted. Yes?
Yeah, I know that we all know about the older Cubans sent to Latin America in the 70s and, the war thing. But I've heard many times that since the first visit of Che Guevara to Africa in the early 1960s, from then on, they began sending some people, experts or soldiers from Cuba, to the Congo, and then even from the first years of the Vietnam War, and from the very beginning, they were sending Cubans there. Is it true? You have something?
Yes. Basically, since very early on in the 60s, when the Castro regime consolidated, they began focusing on exporting the revolution worldwide. And they would send everything from what they called, sometimes they would call them technicians, or they would have different names, but basically they were either military support or security agents or intelligence agents. And they were in Africa and Latin America. John McCain, when he was in Vietnam, famously wrote in his memoirs that he was tortured by a Cuban technician, I think they called him, or whatever it was. So these were people that were sent to these countries with different responsibilities to try to replicate the Cuban model or help replicate the Cuban model abroad. So yes, the Cuban influence in again, to different levels. Sometimes it was more reduced, sometimes it was full military units like Angola, was there from the very beginning, and we're still seeing it today. Despite everything we've talked about with the health crisis, the energy crisis, the financial crisis, we're still seeing them send troops to Ukraine and try to influence other parts of the world.
And the difference is, I think that at the beginning maybe there was some cooperation, sincere cooperation with other exporting. But now in the last 2 years since Angola, they have doing that. They are doing that for money.
Right.
The government in all those corporations, they have become very rich from Angola, from other places. And they are selling these guys who go to Ukraine for a lot of money.
Right. Money is always, especially since the special period, and even now, money is the central motivating factor. Even the medical brigades that were sent around the world, it was all for money, really. And it provided income that, again, it invested in repressing the population even further. So it just kind of takes money to maintain power. Any other questions? Yep. Hey.
Daniel, congratulations on your
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. In your opinion, what do you think is the main reason why left-wing parties, human rights activists across Latin America have kept silent about everything that has happened in Cuba over the last 7 years? I mean, is there, aside from, of course, romanticizing the regime, do you think there's, for example, active Cuban lobbying in those countries to prevent them from speaking about it? What are the reasons why this goes in those?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Cuba has focused domestically on repression and keeping and holding onto power, and internationally on keeping that image. Part of it is ideological. Part of it is kind of this myth of Cuba as the bulwark of the developing world against Yankee imperialism, right, and selling that image. But with that comes a diplomatic effort and a propaganda effort that, again, didn't start yesterday. It started in 1959 and has continued since. With that, you have agreements that are based on trade and based on other interests. And so you do have that still be very powerful, right? And we see it, in the strength that Cuban regime and that Cuban myth has in a lot of countries in the world. Even if you extract the element of U.S.-Cuba relations, just the Cuban regime itself and that vision that it provides to the world is attractive to certain governments or to certain countries, and has been for a long time. So yeah, I mean, it's a very complex relationship that's worth a whole other book and study. But yes, it's definitely there, and it's not just ideological. It's more complex than that.
I would also point to the myth of Che Guevara and the way that his story resonates still today with so many people in the region, and how he, of course, played an important role in sustaining the revolution and taking it abroad.
Right.
The way he died in Bolivia.
Right. He became the mythical illustration of the revolution, right? This young idealist, right, that came from abroad, even, right, motivated by what the revolution was trying to do, and worked to kind of help it consolidate in Cuba, and then went on his revolutionary road where he met his end, and that myth is very attractive.
War, when he wrote
right.
That he was calling for 1,000 Vietnams throughout Latin America to challenge the great imperialists.
Right. You always root for David.
Yep. Exactly. Yep.
But you know what? There is a point that I bring out, and that is that this image of anti-Americanism that you see in the European left and you see in some of that is now coming at a cost. Because if you look at the latest national security doctrine from the Trump administration and Rubio's foreign policy, is Europe is part of the enemy. That we're losing our ties to Europe, that Israel's a much better ally, that Japan's a much better ally. And I think this is a price of that leftist heritage. And I like to point that out to our European friends.
So the documentary Nadie Escuchaba from the 80s, made by Memoria and Jorge with the collaboration of Cubans in exile. There's a scene where they're in an international forum, I think in France, I don't know if it was Amnesty or someone else, but you have basically testimonies of former political prisoners in Cuba, the famous scene of Eduardo Capote showing the finger he was missing. There's that, and I mean, at the end of the 1970s, Jimmy Carter was prioritizing human rights, and then when he goes to Cuba in the early 2000s, he meets with dissidents. Obama did the same thing. So I don't think you can say there's a complete silence from about some human rights abuses in Cuba, but I mean, yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
No, it's a good point. I mean, I agree with that. It's not a complete silence, but I think it's been very, I mean, U.S. foreign policy has been so clumsy, so overstated at different points that it's easy to criticize. But it's a statement from Marco Rubio the other day. The Europeans complaining about the bombing of the Venezuelan so-called drug vessels. Wherever you stand on that issue, the Europeans are complaining about that. At the same time, they're asking for Tomahawk missiles, and that becomes a contradiction. Sorry, Ambassador.
Any more questions? Please. Remember,
Oh, sorry.
I was going to ask the most recent example, right, of political prisoners that were masses, right? Were the J6ers, they're all accounted for?
They are.
They are.
Yeah, between those that are in prison, which are the majority of them that are still in prison, and those that have been released. They are accounted for largely because there was a good effort by family members to account them from the beginning, right? So, and this is where technology is so important, where you have now, just like they were able to organize nationally on July 11th, to simultaneously nationwide organize through WhatsApp groups and all that. They're able to use social media. They're able to document, okay, my son was taken to this prison, and or if they're, and that's something that's very important. Also, there's for the past few, probably decade or so, with the increase of social media and communications and the ability of Cubans to have means of communication, even with the outside world. Any time that there's even a prominent dissident like Berta Soler or Jose Darín Ferrer, who just came to exile, any of them, and they're taken in for questioning, and they don't, like, that's it, they're taken in for questioning, you don't know where they are. There's immediate alerts. Oh, so and so has disappeared. Now that's a temporary disappearance. I didn't include that in the book because a few maybe hours later they're let go. So that's a little different, but just the concept of it is also in the consciousness. So it's used to put out the alarm, and it goes out on CubaNet, it goes out on Diario de Cuba, whatever it is, all these news agencies that carry those stories, because it helps protect the individual. If everyone knows, okay, we're looking at you, we know you took that person in for questioning, you better let them go. That helps protect them versus like, oh, we don't know where they are, and no one raises the alarm, right? So it's almost a preventive measure.
One more thing that I wanted to add, I think like eventually you'll see a lot more of the disappearance come to light with what they did in terms of like how they left Cuba, they went to Nicaragua, and then down into.
That's a very good point. I also include that in the book to the best that I can, but just to mention that's another disappearance. I mentioned the sea route.
Of course.
There's also the land route of Cubans leaving, going through South America and going into the southern border. I included the cases that were reported in news outlets, to the best of my ability, but that is another one that is a very difficult situation. Yeah. Yeah, but that is, yeah, I did include it just to at least have some representative examples of it, so that you also include it. We talk about the balseros, and that's right, but there's all these other people as well who have disappeared.
Thank you for your book.
Sure.
I mean,
Thank
it's
you.
great that you bring all this to life.
Thank you.
There's a lot of people who need to read this. That's not just the Cuban American.
Right. Thanks. Appreciate it. Hey. Thank you.
I wanted to find out if all of these people that you found that disappeared, have you included them into Maria Orlao's Cuban archives?
It's kind of the inverse. So they were. So some of them were already in the Cuba archive, and I took that information as far as the disappearances. I'm not sure how she's tallying the more recent cases. Again, Ukraine, the people that left through the land route. I'm not sure how she's categorizing those. But at least for the more classic cases, I did take a lot of the information from Cuba archive.
That whole study was done by Dr. Lagos.
Right. Armando Lago was really the founder of Archivo Cuba.
He worked on a case with
Yeah. Sure.
my father was Cuban.
Yeah. So definitely,
He passed away.
right. Yeah.
But he did it like a police, he told me it was like a police investigation. Every single one had to have
Yeah.
witnesses, names, you know.
Yeah, and that archive is indispensable for anything dealing with human rights cases in Cuba. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's give Daniel a hand. Thank you again very much for joining us tonight. I have a small announcement to make. The Cuban Research Institute is having its conference in February 26th and 27th of next year. And there are, I'm looking through the panels right now, there is a particular panel on Angola that will discuss the issue of people who are not on the official list of killed in combat. The families have gone to this mausoleum that they have in Camagüey, and they have a list of dead, and they cannot find their relatives there, and they know that they died in Angola. So there you go, that's another point. And there will be at least one presentation talking about a future commission of truth and reconciliation that will deal with the issue of counting and bringing all these crimes to the surface. Whether or not there will be punishment is a different thing, but at least we need to know what happened and when. Again, thank you very much for coming. Hope to see you again soon.